Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 10th of July. Today we're looking at important developments from New York specifically, and then from the Toretsk axis more broadly. There is also some new information surrounding Pobieda, the Pokrovsk Direction, Chasiv Yar, and Vovchansk, but I think I will focus most of the video on the changes around New York because those are rather important. But we're going to begin by looking at Pobieda, specifically south of the village. This is a part of the front line that really has been inactive during a time period where there were so many fierce clashes just a couple of kilometers southwards in Novomikhailivka and right now in the fields just south of that village. And so it's really interesting to see how the Russian forces did not try to take advantage of their momentum following the capture of Pobieda and the Zhveronets fortification system located around here and try to push all the way to the highway from this particular axis north of Novomikhailivka. This region with all the fields is also located on a really important hill that overlooks the road that I just talked about and also overlooks the chain of villages where the Russians are now trying to push through directly from Parskovivka and into Kostantinivka. It could be related to how the Ukrainians moved in elements of the 79th Air Assault Brigade and the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, in addition to the 31st Mechanized Brigade, to generally man the region just south of Marinka all the way to Novomikhailivka, an area that is just filled with open fields, not many trenches, but is rather well mined. And the Ukrainians just wanted to prevent the Russians from taking advantage of a lack of organized settlements and defense lines over there to continue pouncing westwards. And so that could be a part of why. It's also because the Russian forces focused most of their efforts here towards directly capturing Novomikhailivka and then advancing southwards through these villages towards the southern flank of Kostantinivka. But in terms of this particular advance that we saw, the Russian forces were able to gain about 1 kilometer in land going westwards, and this was verified by a video from July 10th from the Ukrainian side of FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers that were advancing through these open fields towards the nearby tree lines. As we go further north, there is information circulating in the Russian media space surrounding this capture of the hospital region and some of the final apartment buildings under Ukrainian control in the northeastern corner of Krasnohorivka. But we do need to wait for more verification of such claims, as that would be important to the dynamics of that battle. And as we go on to something that was claimed by Ukrainian sources and is now essentially being agreed upon by all sides, it's how the Russian forces were able to kick the Ukrainians out of one of the two remaining strongholds that the Ukrainians control just east of Vovchansk and Pokrovsk. And so now the Russian forces have basically gotten control over all of Ivanivka, and they do have control, of course, of the road leading towards the final remaining dachas right next to the river and towards the last remaining fortification system, which is partially under Ukrainian control, because the one that they just were able to enter is either under some sort of Russian control, meaning infantry squads are operating there, or it's just a gray zone because of general shelling from both sides and FPV strikes. And so the Ukrainians at this point, they have a very limited amount of men east of the river. Vast majority of the companies, and then on a smaller level, the squads that are operating here are actually a few kilometers westwards, operating within these two villages. And even then, it's not any sort of significant amount, as most of the garrison here is either within the trench lines that were built or further westwards in some of the tributaries that sort of stretch out from the Toretsk River or are located on the Ural embankment, which is an area where the Ukrainians have rather high elevation, and it's connected to the same embankment that the Russians were able to advance through from Cheratina towards villages like Vovchansk and Pokrovsk as we speak right now. And so in my last video, I really went in depth about the fortification layers the Ukrainians are building up, so I won't focus on it too much. But my main point here is that the Russian forces have been able to secure the vast majority of the bank east of the river, and now they're closing in on the final Ukrainian strongholds like Novoselivka, Pereshov from the north, where they conducted a lot of preparation by essentially clearing out any sort of Ukrainian resistance in tree lines north of the village and sort of getting positions that are very close to supply lines to just make it as hard as possible for the Ukrainians to mount a protracted resistance. And then that has implications for the rest of the bridgehead, I would say, for the rest of the salient in Yasnobrdivka or in the fields in between, and then looking further north. Now, looking at New York, there is a really important change that occurred last night, as confirmed by both sides. The Russian sources also mentioned that they were able to breach the Ukrainian line and advance north of Yurivka and reach what is referred to as Pokrovsk Gora, which I would just say is a suburb of New York. And this is also verified by Ukrainian mapping. So, in terms of the extent of the advance, it amounts to 1.4 kilometers nearly. And the Russian forces, per these reports, were able to capture the apartment complex within the suburb. They were able to get control over some of the further eastward parts of the suburb, including a lot of cottages, parts of the garage complex, these various bushes. Westwards, they got control of some private residential areas, and now they're pushing through the northern parts of the suburb towards the remaining houses and duplexes, I guess. And what's important about this part of New York is that it's just knocking at the heart of the actual town. And so now the Russian forces, they have this rather large apartment complex, which is a very good vantage point. It's been taken so quickly that it hasn't been destroyed. And so if it isn't destroyed in the future quickly, the Russian forces will very quickly turn it into a firing point and an observation post to overlook the rest of New York, which is located on a really, really low lying area because it just runs through this valley where the Toretsk River is located in. And so New York is on really low elevation, as you can see here. And that would give the Russians a very good vantage point to overlook Ukrainian positions in some of these private residential areas to the east or to the west. And it also gives them a springboard to reach into the final remaining Ukrainian strong point in the city. If you zoom in, there's this really large chemical factory plant, which would serve as the main hub for Ukrainian resistance at the moment. And that's an area that's very close to where the Russians are advancing through. If you look further westwards, you have a few other important areas like the cultural center that the Russians are close to. You have this road, this horizontal road that the Russians are close to cutting off. This road is so important because it connects the entirety of New York. New York is a relatively wide settlement, you could say, spanning several kilometers east to west. And so you need that horizontal road to connect between parts of the front line where the Russians are pressing from in Yurivka, and then the front line further eastwards where you have all the trenches built. And so that's one part that's important. The other aspect to look at is how this horizontal road connects to the rest of the Ukrainian defense line built over here. There's a rather significant Ukrainian line that was built here. And the reason why I set up here is because partially it's located on that horizontal road. In certain portions, there's also rather high elevated hills that are connecting between villages like Yurivka to Sukhabalka. So the Ukrainians have the height advantage over here, wherever I'm putting my X's. And so, yeah, the defense line was built here to prevent the Russians essentially from getting this momentum and then pushing into the western flank of Toretsk and towards the southern flank of Konstantinivka more broadly, as I talked about in my last video. And so now cutting off this road between New York and other villages on this defense line would undermine the cohesiveness of the Ukrainian defensive plans over here. And the assaults over here are almost exclusively being conducted by ex-DPR forces that are part of the 1st Army Corps, most notably the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade, but you also have the 9th Motor Rifle Regiment. I believe that's its name. You can see it over here. It's actually a brigade. And then there's also, of course, cooperation with the Veterans PMC. And so they're the main units that are operating in here and in Toretsk. And they're not just advancing towards Gora to the northwest, but also directly along the rail line. And that's also concerning because they're very close to actually crossing past the Toretsk River, which is relatively narrow here, and there is a crossing past the river, and then reaching just the heartland of New York. And we can see that they were able to advance based on this geolocation from July 10th, which shows a Russian infantry squad advancing, running along the rail line in plain sight of the Ukrainians and also in broad daylight. And once they encountered Ukrainian shelling, they started hiding within one of the nearby windbreaks. And there's just so much shrubbery here because, it hasn't been shelled that much and nobody's really trying to maintain, a nice shape for the windbreaks. And so there's just so much foliage over there. So the Russians tried using that to their advantage. And they're just continuing to advance along this rail vector towards the center of New York, but then also in this southeastern suburb of New York, which I guess sort of runs into eastern New York. It's an area that, you do have a vertical road leading directly into some of the denser parts of the village and also towards some of the fortifications that the Ukrainians built over the past 10 years to defend against a direct Russian assault from the east over here. And so that's one of the biggest concerns the Ukrainians essentially have with losing New York. Losing New York would mean that all of these defensive positions that they built up that really are well fortified, they were well built, a lot of mines and whatever forces are here are well equipped, they would have to abandon those positions or be encircled because it's just not beneficial anymore. You lost New York, and so this pocket would have to be closed, and it would mean just a big loss of territory, and then also making such a large amount of effort turn into something superfluous. Additionally, the capture of New York would give the Russians this western flank and the horizontal road that I talked about to begin undermining the Ukrainian defense line that I discussed from the western or from the eastern direction. And then from there, go on and begin assaulting areas like Sukha Balka horizontally instead of head on, which means they would be able to bypass a lot of the head on fortifications that were built by the Ukrainians. And then, most importantly, is how it connects to Toretsk. Taking over New York would give the Russians a direct route using the road that I'm marking with these red arrows and, of course, the rail line axis to just advance onto the southern flank of the city. And that southern flank is so important because it's not really well fortified in the area where I showed with my arrows. There is a sort of perimeter right outside of the city, but on the road towards there, it's not that well fortified. And so there is a danger that the Ukrainians would not be able to stabilize the front line in Nelipivka. And by then, the Russian forces would be able to stretch out the Ukrainians even more and also have a converging vector from the east where they're fighting in the suburbs, in the eastern suburbs, and then also attack from the south, trying to envelop the city from multiple directions. And that's generally the plan of the Russians here. And due to the pace in which they were able to take New York, it is becoming a concern that the Ukrainians would have to move in a larger amount of resources to try to stabilize the line in New York. And to do so, it would also yield higher casualties because you need to just send in troops very quickly and engage out in the open with the Russian offensive head on. And that is something that the Ukrainian garrison just less than a month ago was just totally unprepared for. And that's why that's a call in all of these reinforcements that we see defending the eastern suburbs of Toretsk, which includes 95th Air Assault Brigade. You have now moving in the Liut Safari Assault Regiment. We're going to get to Liut later on in the video. The 32nd Mechanized Brigade. And then you also have some other units here, 28th most notably. But the three units that I mentioned at the beginning, they released this compilation and it was published within the Telegram channel of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, which confirms that there is very heavy fighting going on within the suburbs of Zalizhny and Pivnishnya. And you could see that it's a joint operation, which included drone drops onto Russian soldiers and houses, FPV strikes, also some artillery strikes, and a few clips of armored vehicles being sent to the front line to just directly fire towards Russian forward operating group. And so these three units that you see listed here, they worked in tandem to spot these Russian forces as they were pushing from house to house in these suburbs and just try to target and pick off as many as possible. And it's something that we've seen in a lot of these urban battles, the Ukrainians releasing these rather long FPV compilations. Most of the strikes, like, you can't really discern if anybody was hurt. And some of them you can because they show you directly, but in others it's just something that you have to think about and you just don't know, it's ambiguous. But that's just a part of using FPVs. They're cheap, and so you could expend a lot of them until you finally hit one of the infantrymen that is advancing. And they do try to hide under rubble, in basements, in shrubbery to just conceal themselves. And you could see one of the geolocations is within a district that the Russians were able to push through this past week and it really take over. And so now the Ukrainians, as the Russians are entering that area, they're just striking them with drones. It's an area that the Liut Police Brigade tried defending, but since then they've been pushed out. And now the nexus of the fighting is within this apartment complex and also just to the west of it, where the Russian forces are trying to expand their salient deeper into Zalizhny, for instance, over here, and just try to protect the flanks of their main positions in the apartment complex. And so for now, the fighting is dragging on, but it is something that you have to note that we're getting more and more videos confirming the Russians are still present here and are advancing. because for a couple of days we didn't have many videos here, which creates the sense of ambiguity that maybe the Russians are no longer present here. But now we do have confirmation that there are still Russian forces and that they're increasing in size within this region just east of Toretsk. And we could also see that with this geolocation here from July 10th, which shows again a FPV strike from the Ukrainian side towards a Russian infantry fighting vehicle that is located just a couple hundred meters away from some of the less dense parts of Pivnishnya. And so this vehicle advanced from Shumi, from the hills north of Shumi, I would say, all the way past these trenches the Russians captured and to this forested region here. And that's an area that is currently a gray zone, but will definitely be utilized by Russian DRGs to try to get a foothold within the suburb, trying to use the concealment of the forestry in order to, push through some of these houses here. And that would open up, of course, another vector of assault for the Russian side head on. And that would be aided, of course, by a vector from the south, where I have this arrow marked over here. And then another significant vector that's being pushed by a lot of the veterans PMC along the rail line and throughout Druzhba. And I just want to remind everybody that it was actually yesterday when I talked about how Ukrainians reported a stark increase in the amount of fab strikes by the Russians. There was a preparation including 15 fab strikes in one day on this axis. And that was just a preparation for the Russians to then renew their assault operations, especially around New York. And there is some footage specifically from the center of Toretsk highlighting how the Fab 1500s are now being utilized to not just strike the front line, but especially some of these positions a couple of kilometers back, because the Russians are thinking ahead. First of all, they want to destroy the temporary deployment points, but they also want to destroy future frontline buildings that would be used by the Ukrainians to sort of fend off the Russians. And so that's also part of their thinking here. Now, moving on to Chasiv Yar, although there isn't much of a frontline change, there has been a story circulating through Ukrainian social media that I would want to share. And you guys could believe it, or you don't have to believe it. It doesn't matter as much to me. More so, I care about the units that were mentioned in the story, because I wasn't aware of all of these units actually being present here. And so, of course, we're going to mention it. And so the Ukrainian side, they said that for a period of 70 days, there was actually a Ukrainian grouping, a rather small grouping consisting of 2 units, specifically the elements of the 225th Battalion of the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade from Kharkiv, and the 223rd Marine Battalion of the 126th Territorial Defense Brigade from Odessa. And so, of course, not the entire battalion was stuck there, but certain elements from these 2 battalions were holed up in what was mentioned as an area around the Canal District, but they didn't actually show us a specific location where they were holed up. It could have been in the area within the district or in the forested area nearby. I have no idea. But what they're claiming is that for 70 days they were stuck in a pocket surrounded by the Russian 98th VDV division, and that their only means of being supplied was through UAVs that dropped supplies, ammo crates, whatever it may be. And in terms of only using UAVs to supply yourself, that's something that happened in Vovchansk for the Russian garrison that was holding out in the aggregate plant and still is. So for the most part, they're still getting supplies via drones. And then also in Krinky, the Marine brigades that were operating there also received a lot of their supplies through drones. And so that part is not necessarily far-fetched. And interestingly, you guys may wonder why a Territorial Defense Brigade has a battalion named a Marine Battalion. And the reason why is because the 126th Brigade was incorporated into Ukraine's Marine Corps, which doesn't really make sense, because for a while the 4 Marine brigades were operating in Kherson in tandem with the 126th Brigade, but I don't know how that relates to them being a Marine ready force. So I don't understand that really, but just so you know. And then the Ukrainians claimed that the siege was finally broken by reinforcements from the 24th Mechanized Brigade that were moved in from the Toretsk direction on June 19th. And they've been a big part of trying to stabilize the front line ever since the Russians captured the Canal District. And so there really was a necessity to moving them, but then the backside is the Russians were more free to advance through the Toretsk axis. And then, of course, they mentioned the other units that are operating here, the most prominent ones at least, because there were others that were not mentioned in this Ukrainian post. But, 67th Mechanized, 41st Mechanized, and 42nd Mechanized. The 41st is not really operating here anymore because it's operating around the Toretsk region. and previously was also fighting in the Kupiansk sector, I believe. And Ukrainian sources just continue highlighting that their 225th Battalion is operating in the forested region south of Kalina, trying to repel any sort of Russian DRG efforts over there. And so that is further acknowledgement that you do have a large Russian reconnaissance presence over there. Now, in Vovchansk, there is a lot to cover. First of all, there is this geolocation that I should have mentioned in earlier videos. I think it's from July 5th. And it shows a strike from the 501st Battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade. FBB just struck a building which had Russian soldiers present in it. And that just caused me to adjust my map slightly, showing that the Russians were in control of an additional 100 meters, more so than what I expected. And then the biggest piece of information circulating on the Russian side this past 24 hours has been that they've been able to cross past the aggregate plants and actually get positions within the southern bank of the Vovcha River. And so let's look at what the Russian sources are claiming to be the actual mapping at the moment. They're claiming that they were able to get this foothold, which includes some of these open fields. It includes this bush ring over here. And it also includes infiltration into some of the first residential areas, including this street over here. And so far, we don't have any sort of video proof, or the Ukrainians have not mentioned it yet. Maybe they will tonight when they come out with some of the daily reports. But that is something to keep an eye out for if that ends up being correct. But it would be hard to see that happening. Of course, it could be realistic, but it is interesting to see how the Russian forces would be able to push from the aggregate plants where they are already under very heavy fire, and then cross over into another area that is generally exposed because it's just an open field near a river, and then begin to just push through into the Ukrainian rear in this region. So I don't know if that's true, but keep an eye out for information surrounding that. But what I do know for sure is that over the past couple of days, there has been a stark increase in the amount of Russian aerial activity in this region. So, for instance, there were 9 air sorties by the Russians over the past 24 hours above the general Kharkiv region, according to Ukrainian reports. And they claim that 15 anti-air missiles, so probably like the S-300s, were launched by the Russians towards the Kharkiv region during that time period, including towards Vovchansk. And then you look at the compilation videos that came out over the past 2 to 3 days, and you just see how many fabs are really being dropped. So here's Vovchansk fab compilation, but this one's a bit older. There's a few ones that are more recent. For instance, this one from the area west of Vovchansk. It's a TOS-1A strike on an ammo depot in a forested region, going a bit deeper. There's a video here of 4 fab 500s being dropped in tandem onto positions in Vovchansk, and there are just so many industrial enterprises and apartment buildings that could be potential targets for these sort of fabs, especially in successive strikes. And the Russians have not really completed their preparation in that regard. And so I do expect to see a lot of additional fab strikes as the battles here go on, in order to make it easier for the Russians if they do end up crossing the river with a significant force. And then, of course, you have the battlefield strikes. So here's a strike on the Ukrainians as they were crossing. I think this is probably from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade or Lyut Brigade, but a Ukrainian unit trying to cross over the bridge here towards the other side of the river, trying to reach the front line, and they were just subjected to this Russian strike. Additionally, some Ukrainian sources mentioned that they were able to retake some of the less dense regions of northern Vovchansk in this area that I'm marking in red, which I need to verify based on video proof. So I need to check if there really is anything amounting to that. But at the same time, just further northwest, we have a video which was released by the Russian side showing the operations of a pair of snipers as they were trying to reach the city itself, and were engaging in a sort of cat and mouse operation, trying to evade Ukrainian shelling and hiding in various trees, and then eventually trying to find a position where they could begin firing towards the Ukrainians located in the cemetery region and in regions just south of it. And then just looking a bit further eastwards past Vovchansk, there was a video here from July 7th, which showed a Russian squad, an infantry squad, being shelled by the 253rd Array Assault Battalion. So the 129th Territorial Defense Brigade previously had some sort of elements around Velika and Vosilka, and also some defending around Avdiivka. Now it appears that some of their elements have been moved to attack or try to defend against Russian assaults in the regions around Tikhe and Zibini. And so this is just confirmation of that for the first time based on their shelling. And yeah, that's all I have for today. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.